March 15, 1984, North Atlantic Ocean, approximately 400 miles southeast of Iceland. USS Spruance, hull number DD-963, conducted anti-submarine warfare patrol in international waters along one of the key transit routes Soviet submarines used when deploying from their northern fleet bases to operational areas in the Atlantic. The mission was routine by 1984 standards. The Spruance had been conducting similar patrols for years, part of the broader American and NATO effort to monitor Soviet submarine movements and maintain awareness of potential threats to Allied shipping and naval forces. Lieutenant Commander Michael Chen, the ship's sonar officer, sat in the sonar control room monitoring the displays showing returns from the SH-60B bow-mounted sonar system. The Spruance was operating in passive mode, listening rather than actively transmitting, reducing the destroyer's own acoustic signature while searching for the distinctive sounds Soviet submarines made despite their best efforts at quiet operations. At 14:37 hours, the sonar operator noticed a faint contact on the passive display. The frequency characteristics suggested machinery noise from a submarine. The bearing was 275 degrees, approximately west-southwest from the Spruance's current position. The operator switched to active mode, transmitting a sonar pulse and listening for the return. The active ping illuminated the contact clearly. Range: 22 nautical miles. Bearing: 275 degrees. Depth: estimated 400 feet based on the return characteristics. The sonar operator called the contact to Lieutenant Commander Chen, who reviewed the acoustic signature personally. Years of training and experience analyzing Soviet submarine signatures enabled him to classify the contact with reasonable confidence. Victor III class attack submarine. One of the Soviet Navy's most capable boats, quieter than earlier Soviet submarines through improved acoustic dampening, titanium pressure hull construction, and careful attention to machinery isolation. If this was indeed a Victor III, the Spruance had detected one of the quietest submarines the Soviet Navy operated. The range was significant. 22 nautical miles exceeded the detection range Soviet submarine sonar systems could reliably achieve against surface ships. The Victor III's sonar, while capable for its era, couldn't match the performance of the SQS-53C the Spruance carried. This meant the American destroyer had detected the Soviet submarine before the submarine had any indication the destroyer was present. First detection provided initiative. The Spruance could track the submarine, position itself advantageously, and engage if necessary, all while the Soviet boat remained unaware it had been detected. Chen reported the contact to the bridge. Captain James Morrison, commanding officer of the Spruance, reviewed the tactical situation quickly. A Soviet submarine transiting these waters represented exactly the type of contact the patrol was designed to detect. The appropriate response was to track the submarine, gather intelligence about its acoustic signature for future reference, and demonstrate American capability to detect and follow Soviet submarines, despite their attempts at stealth. Captain Morrison ordered the ship to come to a course that would maintain position relative to the submarine while keeping it within sonar range. He also ordered launch of one SH-60B Seahawk helicopter from the ship's hangar. The Seahawk, designated Lamps III for Light Airborne Multipurpose System, was specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare operations from destroyer-sized warships. Each Spruance-Class destroyer carried 2 Seahawks, significantly extending the ship's ASW reach beyond the range of hull-mounted sonar. The Seahawk launched within 10 minutes, climbing away from the destroyer's flight deck and proceeding toward the bearing where the submarine had been detected. The helicopter carried sophisticated sensor systems, including Sonobuoys that could be dropped into the water to listen for submarine acoustic signatures, a magnetic anomaly detector that could detect the subtle disturbances submarines created in the Earth's magnetic field, and MKP-46 torpedoes for engagement if required. As the Seahawk approached the submarine's estimated position, the tactical coordinator aboard the helicopter dropped a pattern of Sonobuoys, passive acoustic sensors, that would transmit detected sounds back to the helicopter. The Sonobuoys confirmed the submarine's presence and provided more precise localization, The magnetic anomaly detector, which measured variations in magnetic field strength, registered a clear return as the helicopter overflew the submarine's position. The combination of sonar detection from the ship, Sonobuoy data from the helicopter, and MAD confirmation provided comprehensive tracking. Aboard the Victor III-class submarine, the captain was conducting routine patrol operations, unaware that he had been detected. Soviet submarine doctrine emphasized stealth through quiet operations. The Victor III was designed to operate silently, avoiding detection by American and NATO anti-submarine forces. The captain believed his boat's acoustic signature was low enough to avoid detection at operationally relevant ranges. The first indication something was wrong came when the submarine's sonar detected active sonar transmissions from multiple bearings. The Spruance's hull-mounted sonar was one source. The Sonobuoys the helicopter had dropped provided others. The Soviet sonar operator reported to the captain that they appeared to be under ASW prosecution by surface forces. The captain ordered the submarine to increase depth and change course, standard evasive maneuvers designed to break contact. The maneuvers were ineffective. The Spruance maintained sonar contact continuously. The helicopter relocated overhead within minutes after the submarine maneuvered, dropping additional Sonobuoys to track the new course. For 8 hours, the pattern repeated. The Soviet submarine would maneuver, attempting to break contact through speed changes, depth changes, and course alterations. The Spruance and its Seahawk helicopter would maintain contact, repositioning as necessary, demonstrating to the Soviet captain that evasion was futile. Finally, recognizing that continuing submerged operations accomplished nothing except depleting battery power and wearing out the crew, the Soviet captain ordered the submarine to surface. The Victor III broke surface approximately 15 nautical miles from the Spruance. Captain Morrison maneuvered the destroyer to maintain visual contact while staying at safe distance. Communication via light signal established basic dialogue between the two commanding officers. The Soviet captain's message was brief but revealing. "Your ship detected us before we knew you were present. Your helicopter found us anywhere we went. We cannot hide from American destroyers." The acknowledgement, transmitted in stilted but comprehensible English, represented admission that Soviet submarine stealth had been defeated by American anti-submarine warfare capability. The encounter was neither unique nor particularly dramatic by Cold War standards. Similar events occurred regularly throughout the 1980s as American ASW forces tracked Soviet submarines transiting between bases and operational areas. But the encounter illustrated the capability gap that shocked Soviet naval planners and demonstrated why the Spruance-class destroyers represented such a significant advancement in anti-submarine warfare. Soviet submarine doctrine during the Cold War emphasized that submerged operations provided stealth that made submarines extremely difficult for surface forces to detect and track. This wasn't unreasonable belief. Submarines operating submerged were hidden from visual observation, emitted minimal acoustic signature if properly designed and operated quietly, and could maneuver in 3 dimensions to evade pursuers. Historical experience from World War II through the early Cold War period suggested that submarines enjoyed significant advantages over surface anti-submarine forces. The Victor III-class submarine represented the Soviet Navy's most capable attack submarine during the early to mid-1980s. The design incorporated titanium pressure hull construction, enabling deeper diving depth than steel-hulled submarines. Acoustic dampening systems reduce machinery noise through careful isolation of equipment from the hull structure. Propeller design minimized cavitation noise. The result was a submarine significantly quieter than earlier Soviet designs, approaching but not quite matching the acoustic performance of contemporary American nuclear submarines. Soviet confidence in submarine stealth was based on operational success during decades of Cold War patrols. Many Soviet submarines had operated undetected by American and NATO forces, completing missions without ever being tracked continuously. Soviet naval intelligence knew that American ASW capability was substantial, but they believed the combination of Soviet submarine quieting improvements and the limitations of surface ship sonar would enable most Soviet submarines to operate without continuous tracking. Soviet doctrine emphasized that American destroyers and frigates while capable of anti-submarine warfare, were compromised by requirements to perform multiple missions. Surface combatants had to provide air defense, surface warfare capability, and anti-submarine capability simultaneously. Soviet planners believed this multi-mission requirement meant American destroyers couldn't be as effective in ASW as dedicated platforms, and that the compromises inherent in multi-mission designs would create exploitable vulnerabilities. The numerical strategy Soviet planners employed assumed that the United States Navy had insufficient ASW platforms to track all Soviet submarines simultaneously. If the Soviet submarine force, numbering several hundred boats, deployed in substantial numbers, American forces would be overwhelmed simply by the quantity of contacts requiring tracking. Some submarines would inevitably penetrate the ASW screen and operate in areas where they could threaten carrier battle groups or merchant shipping. One Soviet naval officer, interviewed after the Cold War ended, described the thinking. "We believed the US Navy had too few specialized ASW ships to track all our submarines effectively. Our strategy was to overwhelm their capability through numbers. Most of our submarines would penetrate their screen and accomplish their missions." This assessment proved incorrect. American capability exceeded what we had estimated. The Spruance-Class destroyers that entered service beginning in 1975 represented purpose-built anti-submarine warfare platforms that challenged every Soviet assumption about American ASW capability. The hull measured 563 feet in length, with full load displacement of approximately 8,000 tons, larger than earlier American destroyers, but sized appropriately for the systems and capabilities the design required. Gas turbine propulsion, specifically 4 General Electric LM-2500 engines producing 80,000 total shaft horsepower, provided 30-plus knots sustained speed with excellent acceleration characteristics and reliability superior to steam turbine plants used in earlier destroyers. The primary sonar system was the SQS-53C, a large bow-mounted sonar with both active and passive operating modes. The active mode transmitted powerful acoustic pulses and analyzed returns, enabling detection of submarines attempting to remain quiet. The passive mode listened for acoustic signatures from submarine machinery, propellers, and hull noise without transmitting, making the Spruance itself harder to detect. Detection ranges varied based on ocean conditions, submarine noise levels, and whether the sonar operated in active or passive mode. Against quiet submarines like the Victor III, the SQS-53C could achieve detection ranges exceeding 20 nautical miles in favorable conditions. Against conventional submarines with diesel engines, detection ranges could reach 40 nautical miles or more. The towed array system, designated SQR-19 Tactus for Tactical Towed Array Sonar, extended passive detection capability substantially. The array towed behind the destroyer at depth consisted of hydrophones in a linear arrangement that could detect submarine acoustic signatures at extended ranges, while itself being difficult for submarines to detect, since it was passive and positioned away from the noise of the towing ship. Multiple submarines could be tracked simultaneously by the towed array, providing situational awareness across a broad ocean area. Weaponry focused entirely on anti-submarine and anti-air missions, reflecting the Spruance-Class design priority. The ASROC launcher, an 8-cell system positioned forward, could fire rocket-boosted Mk-46 torpedoes to ranges exceeding 10 nautical miles. ASROC provided the capability to engage submarines detected by sonar, but located beyond the range where ship-launched torpedoes could reach them effectively. The rocket would fly ballistically to the target area, release the torpedo, which would enter the water and home acoustically on the submarine. The combination of long-range sonar detection and ASROC engagement meant Spruance-class destroyers could engage submarines immediately upon detection, rather than maneuvering closer for conventional torpedo attacks. Mk-46 torpedo tubes mounted on the ship provided close-range anti-submarine capability. The Mk-46 lightweight torpedo used active and passive acoustic homing to find and engage submarines, effective against both nuclear and conventional submarines at ranges of several miles. The helicopter capability was transformative. Two SH-60B Seahawk helicopters embarked on each Spruance-Class destroyer, housed in a hangar aft with a flight deck for launch and recovery operations. The Seahawks carried dipping sonar that could be lowered into the water while the helicopter hovered, providing mobile sonar capability independent of the ship's position. Sonobuoys dropped-in patterns provided additional acoustic detection. The magnetic anomaly detector could confirm submarine presence by detecting magnetic field disturbances. Mk-46 torpedoes enabled the helicopters to engage submarines they detected. Most importantly, data link systems transmitted information between helicopters and ship in real time, creating an integrated tactical picture that extended the destroyer's effective ASW radius more than 50 nautical miles from the ship itself. The fire control system, designated SQQ-89, integrated data from all sensors, hull sonar, towed array, helicopter inputs, and external sources like maritime patrol aircraft or other ships, into a comprehensive tactical picture. The system automatically correlated contacts, predicted submarine positions based on course and speed, and provided weapon assignment recommendations. The integration meant Spruance-class destroyers could manage multiple submarine contacts simultaneously while coordinating with other ASW forces in the area. The design was purpose-built for anti-submarine warfare. Unlike earlier destroyers that compromised ASW capability to accommodate other mission requirements, the Spruance-class prioritized submarine detection and engagement. The hull form optimized sonar performance. Internal volume accommodated extensive sonar processing equipment. The gas turbine propulsion minimized acoustic signature that might interfere with sonar operations. Every aspect of the design served the primary ASW mission. The crew numbered more than 300 personnel, including specialists trained extensively in anti-submarine warfare operations. Sonar operators trained for months, learning to identify submarine acoustic signatures and distinguish contacts from biological sources or oceanographic phenomena. Helicopter detachments practiced coordinated operations with ship crews until the integration became seamless. The emphasis on training ensured that sophisticated equipment was operated by personnel capable of exploiting its full capability. The cost per ship, approximately $300 million in 1975 when the first ships were delivered, represented significant investment in anti-submarine capability. But the capability provided justified the expense. Each Spruance-class destroyer could track multiple submarines simultaneously across ocean areas measuring hundreds of square miles, engage contacts at ranges where Soviet submarines couldn't respond effectively, and sustain operations for weeks without returning to port. Operational employment of Spruance-class destroyers throughout the 1980s demonstrated capability that exceeded Soviet expectations and validated American investment in specialized ASW platforms. Atlantic barrier patrols represented one of the primary missions for Spruance-class destroyers. The Gyeonggi Gap, Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom, formed a choke point where Soviet submarines transiting from northern fleet bases to the Atlantic Ocean had to pass through relatively confined waters. Spruance-class destroyers, operating in coordination with maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, and fixed sonar arrays, formed detection lines across these passages. Soviet submarines attempting to transit faced detection by multiple overlapping systems with minimal chance of passing undetected. A specific example from 1985 illustrated the tracking capability these operations achieved. USS Moosbrugge, one of the Spruance-class destroyers, detected a Soviet Akula-class submarine transiting through the Norwegian Sea southbound toward the Atlantic. The Moosbrugge established contact and maintained it for 27 days as the submarine continued south, transited into the Atlantic, and proceeded across the ocean toward the Caribbean. The tracking required coordination with other ASW assets as the submarine moved beyond the Moosbrugge's operating area, but the contact was never lost. When the submarine finally returned to base, Soviet naval intelligence concluded that it had operated undetected throughout its patrol. Post-Cold War revelations documented that American forces had tracked it continuously. The submarine never knew it had been detected. Helicopter coordination multiplied the effectiveness of Spruance-class destroyers beyond what hull-mounted sonar alone could achieve. The SH-60B Seahawks operated ahead of the ship, detecting submarines before they came within range of the destroyer's sonar. Data transmitted to the ship via secure data link enabled the tactical team to develop comprehensive tracking solutions while the submarine remained unaware it had been detected. When prosecution was required, either for training or in response to submarine behavior deemed threatening, the helicopters could engage with Mk-46 torpedoes independently of the ship, attacking from positions and directions the submarine might not anticipate. ASROC employment in exercises demonstrated the ability to engage submarines immediately after detection. The rocket launch, ballistic flight, and torpedo water entry occurred so rapidly that submarines had minimal warning between detection and engagement. Soviet submarines practicing against simulated ASROC attacks found the timeline compressed beyond their ability to respond effectively. The range advantage meant that Soviet submarines attempting to engage American destroyers with their own torpedoes would be engaged by ASROC before they reached launch range for their weapons. Mediterranean operations presented particularly challenging acoustic conditions. The Mediterranean's relatively shallow waters, heavy maritime traffic, and complex underwater topography created difficult environments for sonar operations. Yet Sixth Fleet Spruance-Class destroyers routinely tracked Soviet submarines operating in the region, maintaining contact despite the acoustic challenges. The capability demonstrated that Spruance-Class performance wasn't limited to ideal deep ocean conditions, but extended to the complex littoral environments where submarine detection was traditionally most difficult. Anti-submarine warfare group tactics integrated Spruance-Class destroyers with P-3 Orion maritime patrol aircraft and American attack submarines, creating comprehensive ASW networks that Soviet submarines found impossible to evade. The P-3s provided wide-area surveillance with sophisticated acoustic sensors and radar. American submarines tracked Soviet boats quietly from positions Soviet submarines didn't suspect. Spruance-class destroyers provided surface prosecution capability and helicopter assets that could respond rapidly to contacts developed by any platform. The integration created redundancy and ensured that even if one platform lost contact, others could maintain tracking. Soviet submarine reactions to being tracked by Spruance-class destroyers evolved as Soviet captains gained experience with American capability. Initial attempts at counter-detection sought to determine when American destroyers had established contact, enabling evasive action before tracking became firmly established. But the Spruance's towed array, operating passively and positioned away from the ship, was difficult for Soviet submarines to detect. Evasive maneuvers after detection proved ineffective as helicopters relocated submarines within minutes of course changes. Some Soviet captains, after extended periods of being tracked continuously, surfaced and acknowledged they had been detected, recognizing that continuing to evade accomplished nothing except exhausting their crews. The total force of 31 Spruance-class destroyers, built between 1975 and 1983, provided comprehensive coverage across multiple ocean areas simultaneously. At any given time during the 1980s, multiple Spruance-class destroyers were deployed on ASW patrol in the Atlantic, Mediterranean, and Pacific. The presence created deterrent effect beyond the specific submarines that were tracked. Soviet submarine captains knew that American destroyers with sophisticated ASW capability were operating throughout the areas where Soviet submarines deployed, creating psychological pressure and constraining Soviet operations. The vulnerability Soviet submarines experienced when operating against Spruance-class destroyers resulted from multiple factors that converged to create decisive American advantage. The acoustic advantage was fundamental. The SQS-53C sonar could detect submarines at ranges exceeding Soviet submarine sonar capability against surface ships. First detection provided initiative that shaped the entire subsequent engagement. The destroyer could position itself advantageously, launch helicopters to develop precise tracking, and prepare weapons for engagement, all while the Soviet submarine remained unaware of the destroyer's presence. Helicopter multiplication transformed single destroyers into multi-platform ASW systems. 2 helicopters per destroyer meant the 31 Spruance-class destroyers collectively operated 62 ASW helicopters. Each helicopter extended detection radius approximately 50 nautical miles from the ship. The result was detection coverage measuring in the thousands of square miles per destroyer, creating grids so extensive that Soviet submarines attempting to transit through areas where Spruance-class destroyers operated faced near-certain detection. ASROC range enabled engagement before Soviet submarines could respond with their own torpedoes. Soviet submarine torpedoes had effective ranges of perhaps 10 to 15 nautical miles depending on the specific weapon. ASROC could engage at 10+ nautical miles, effectively matching submarine torpedo range. But the critical advantage was that ASROC launch and torpedo delivery occurred within minutes, while Soviet submarines required longer to maneuver into firing positions and launch weapons. The timeline advantage meant Spruance-class destroyers could engage detected submarines before those submarines could threaten the destroyer. Training emphasis throughout the United States Navy on anti-submarine warfare created proficiency that Soviet submariners couldn't match. American sonar operators spent thousands of hours analyzing acoustic signatures, learning to distinguish submarine contacts from biological sources or oceanographic phenomena. Helicopter crews practiced coordinated operations continuously. The training created expertise that turned sophisticated equipment into decisive capability. Soviet submarine noise levels, even in the quietest boats, like the Victor III or later Akula-class, remained higher than American Los Angeles-class attack submarines. The acoustic signature difference meant Soviet submarines were detectable at greater ranges than Soviet planners anticipated when assessing their stealth capability. The gap between Soviet self-assessment of their quieting and actual performance against American sonar created vulnerability that Soviet submariners discovered operationally rather than through analysis. The legacy of Spruance-class destroyers shaped anti-submarine warfare doctrine and influenced subsequent ship designs in ways that remain relevant decades after the last ships of the class retired. The strategic impact demonstrated that purpose-built anti-submarine warfare surface ships could hunt submarines effectively, negating the stealth advantage Soviet submarine forces depended upon. Soviet submarine force advantages in numbers became less significant when American ASW forces could detect and track substantial percentages of deployed submarines. The deterrent effect extended beyond actual tracking to create uncertainty among Soviet planners about whether their submarines could accomplish strategic objectives in wartime. The Spruance-class served for approximately 30 years, with the last ships decommissioning around 2005. The longevity reflected sound design and the continued relevance of the ASW capability they provided. As the ships aged, they were replaced by Arleigh Burke-class destroyers that incorporated equal or superior ASW capability alongside enhanced air defense and surface warfare systems. The Arleigh Burke-class continued the emphasis on sophisticated sonar, integrated combat systems, and helicopter operations that characterized the Spruance design. Doctrine influence extended beyond American forces to shape NATO and Allied ASW thinking. The integrated approach combining surface ships, helicopters, maritime patrol aircraft, and submarines became standard methodology for anti-submarine operations. Soviet submarines attempting to operate against NATO forces faced coordinated multi-platform prosecution that gave them minimal chance of avoiding detection throughout their patrols. The doctrine remained relevant into the 21st century as submarine threats evolved, but the fundamental principles of integrated ASW continued to guide operations. Soviet admission of American ASW effectiveness came gradually through post-Cold War analysis and memoirs by former Soviet naval officers. The consistent theme was that American capability had exceeded Soviet estimates, that Soviet submarines faced greater risk of detection than doctrine assumed, and that the submarine force advantage in numbers couldn't overcome the technological and tactical advantages American ASW forces possessed. Some accounts acknowledged that Soviet submarine forces would not have achieved their strategic objectives in major conflict due to losses and tracking that would have resulted from engagement with American and NATO ASW forces. March 15, 1984. USS Spruance detected a Soviet Victor III class submarine at 22 nautical miles beyond the range where the Soviet submarine could detect the destroyer. The Spruance's helicopter extended tracking throughout an 8-hour pursuit. The Soviet captain eventually surfaced and acknowledged that his submarine couldn't hide from American destroyers. The encounter wasn't unique. It was typical of Cold War ASW operations, where Spruance-Class destroyers demonstrated capability that shocked Soviet planners and validated American investment in purpose-built anti-submarine warfare platforms. The Soviet Union had believed that submarines operated invisibly in the ocean depths, that their acoustic signatures were too quiet for surface ships to detect reliably, that their maneuverability in 3 dimensions would enable evasion of pursuers. These beliefs were based on decades of submarine doctrine and operational experience, suggesting that submerged operations provided decisive advantages over surface anti-submarine forces. American Spruance-class destroyers made Soviet submarines visible through sophisticated sonar detecting them at unprecedented ranges, made them trackable through helicopter assets that extended coverage across vast ocean areas, made them vulnerable through weapons that could engage immediately after detection. The paradigm Soviet submarine forces operated under was obsolete, rendered irrelevant by technology and training that created ASW capability they couldn't counter. 31 Spruance-class destroyers, operating throughout the 1980s and into the 2000s, provided the backbone of American anti-submarine warfare. They detected Soviet submarines transiting choke points. They tracked them across oceans. They demonstrated that surface ships equipped with proper sensors and weapons could hunt submarines effectively, rather than simply defending against them. The shift from defensive ASW to offensive submarine hunting represented a fundamental change in naval warfare that Soviet forces never successfully countered. The USSR believed submarines were invisible hunters stalking surface fleets. American Spruance-class destroyers transformed submarines into the hunted, visible to sophisticated sonar, trackable by persistent helicopters, vulnerable to weapons they couldn't evade. The reversal of submarine warfare's fundamental dynamic demonstrated that technology and training could overcome advantages that had seemed inherent to submerged operations. 70 years of submarine development had created vessels that operated silently in ocean depths, threatening surface ships with near impunity. American anti-submarine warfare development, concentrated in designs like the Spruance-class destroyer, demonstrated that submarines could be detected, tracked, and engaged by surface forces equipped with appropriate capabilities. The balance between submarines and anti-submarine forces shifted decisively during the Cold War, and Soviet submarine forces found themselves operating in oceans where invisibility was no longer assured and stealth no longer guaranteed survival.